From the eternal sea, he rises, creating armies on either shore.
What better way to kick off the season than with a good old death ranking? Basically, to warrant one of these, we need a series in which death is very common, and for whatever reason, the deaths have to be unique. In the case of the Omen franchise, it's usually Satan himself, putting an end to those who prove inconvenient, and the way he does it is usually fun to watch, so in this video, we're going to be ranking all 39 of those. I'm not going to include the infant deaths, such as the first movie and Omen 3, because they're merely there for plot purposes, and there are other deaths not caused by Satan, and obviously I will include them, despite those not being as interesting. Keep in mind there is a total of 6 movies, for those who don't know about Omen 4, the final conflict, my ass. And as for the remake, I'm going to be counting those as 1, because they're usually the same, just not as good. But if they're substantially different, then they will be included. Again, that's 39 to my count, so let's see how they stack up. It's kind of odd that Omen 3 would have the lowest spot, as it's not the worst in the franchise, but it's still not good, and one of the dumbest aspects are a bunch of priests who think it'd be a good idea to try and kill Damien in ways that put themselves in bad situations. Despite the fact that Damien can manipulate basically everything, this leads to most of them dying in relatively stupid ways, but the dumbest of all has to be Antonia. We'll get to his friend a bit later, but at least he didn't confront Damien while on a horse directly over a ledge.
What a stupid idea!
I don't even think the devil had to do anything here. Common sense tells you animals are going to be afraid, so when he plummets to his death off the bridge, I don't really have any sympathy. He's easily the dumbest character in this franchise. The death is blatantly obvious, so easy pick for last place.
Where is it?
It's already been loaded. I saw Damien's face.
Where is it?
It may seem crazy to put an Omen 2 death this low, but Charles is fucking stupid. He's absolutely terrified, hiding in the church, completely aware of who Damien is, but despite that he decides to take Richard to the train yard to show him Damien's image. He could have just given him directions. Again, he was completely safe, but he doesn't, instead standing directly on the track, and his fate isn't that hard to see coming. There's been like 5 fatalities. How could you look surprised? The only reason this is not at the bottom is because he isn't a priest, so maybe he didn't know or something. But again, it seemed like he fucking knew.
I warned you about this. I spoke to you and your husband about this thing. No, you're not gonna pay attention.
Omen 4 is an abysmal movie. Practically unwatchable. And most of the deaths aren't bad for any reason, aside from being a dull scene in an awful movie. Morris happened to be the father of a cliche kid who picked on girl Damien, and upon making some inconvenient threats, he had to die. He ends up being decapitated, yet we only see the clown head roll, and the reason this is a particularly bad death is because of how poorly the scene is done. It looks like he did it deliberately. It was clearly already in place. Of all the decapitations in history, this is not one of the greats.
Can't just walk away from this. What the fuck do you think he was gonna say?
Speaking of decapitation, we have Keith Jennings in the remake. A remake death that I include despite being the same type of death. The way they changed it is beyond insulting. We'll get to the original death later, way later, but the decapitation being caused by a sign opposed to flying glass is just a weak change. If you compare these back to back, you can't tell me the original isn't way superior. I don't know why they did this, maybe a forced difference, but just another reason to avoid this awful remake. These are 2 characters who die at the beginning of Omen 4 because the plot says so. One of them has a heart attack. Before that, she's doing this. The other just dies. I don't even know why he had to die. It looks stupid as hell, and they put them together because they serve the same purpose, being nothing. So, moving on. This one isn't so much stupid, more so uninteresting, but the one that preceded it is actually good, and we'll get to that a bit later. These 2, however, come to the conclusion that trying to trick Satan is not going to work, and to get away from the lightning storm, lock themselves underground, and allegedly starve to death. Obviously a double kill, maybe a triple kill if you count the first one, but not that interesting at all. Watching these fools die is the only fun part of the movie, so simply starving to death is a disappointment.
Faith in the source, I enter the pit of damnable sin!
And ending off the bad tier, yeah, not too many of these, we have the aforementioned sister who engaged in a slap fight earlier. She She's doing the thing when you put yourself in a dangerous situation and rely on God to save you. You can probably see the outcome coming, and this actually could have been a good scene. The problem is how it goes wrong. Detective Earl Knight, the only memorable character in the movie, thinks it'd be a good idea at this very moment to show her a picture of girl Damien. What could go wrong? Obviously a lot, but the scene is pretty terrifying. Honestly don't know if it would really look like that, but the overall stupidity keeps it from being okay.
Take him.
So this death is again kind of stupid. I mean, what did he think was gonna happen? He's clearly surrounded by dogs. Probably not the finest idea, but at least the death is memorable, being mauled to death. Definitely one of the more painful ways to die in this franchise. And again, at least he wasn't on a fucking horse. Can't be too high, but it's okay.
Damien! He's the whole Karen. Damien is the power!
Like I said, Omen 4 is just a really bad movie, and various deaths that simply advance the plot are deaths in a real bad movie. Hastings is a character you could probably guess wasn't good the whole time, as every Omen movie has these. Same goes for Lisa, yet another evil nanny, so for the film to end they both must die. Karen takes them out, and that's that. Technically not the same kind of death, but the effect is no different. Not memorable, but also not offensive.
Yes, Mother. See him. Really see him.
And the next one is Karen herself. Because like a lot of these movies, Satan kind of has a lot of power, and if he doesn't want you doing something, the odds are it's not gonna happen. I used to think Karen simply couldn't go through with it. Now I realize she probably had no choice. Either way, it's something YouTube doesn't allow discussing, and in this case, who really cares? Omen 4 is already almost out.
I've already told you he was born March 23rd. Now you gotta believe me.
Dean's death is somewhat memorable due to its gruesome nature, but I still can't say I was really enthused. He's another character who refuses Damien's will, being killing his son, but his wife becomes possessed, gets that done for him with an iron, no doubt, and obviously he meets the same fate. Not sure if that's what it would look like, but overall, this one is kind of just there. It's okay, but that's really all it is.
And I need it out of me. I need it out of me now.
And with that, we finally reach the first Omen. Honestly, a pretty damn good movie, and most of these deaths do get fairly high. Unfortunately, the least good one is kind of just there for plot purposes. It happens when the group are essentially heading to get an abortion, and are struck by another vehicle. This definitely kills the driver. I think Father Gabriel is dead too. He's not seen again, so he must be. Nothing wrong with it, it makes sense, so it's the okay section. Nothing to dislike, and nothing substantial.
What's going on up there?
Traffic.
Yeah, the okay deaths are proving to be real difficult to find things to say about them. An example of that would be the only death. The ambassador is killed in an explosion to advance Robert's career, and that's it. It's a plot point they threw in, it's fine, it looks okay, moving on.
We are now about to enter a highly complex experimental area where the use of toxic chemicals...
Omen 2 may as well be called People Find Out Things They Wish They Hadn't Found Out. At this point in the movie, that's to be expected. David and an unnamed worker must be poisoned by toxins following an unexpected gas leak, for the aforementioned reason of being an inconvenience, which will eventually lead into another death right after, which we'll get to later, as a result of Damien's class being there, and only him not being affected. It's a perfectly okay scene. Watching him almost escape only to fall back in is a nice touch, but in the grand scheme of Omen 2, not one of the very best.
You have won nothing.
You know, you can call me lazy, but I guess I don't give a shit about this movie. Once all the priests get themselves killed, the movie becomes real boring, and by the end, I just don't care what's happening. That's why it's in the okay section, it's a serviceable ending. Peter winds up getting used as the shield, dying in his mother's arms. Kate stabs Damien in the back using the dagger. He eventually dies after mocking Christ for thinking he won, and given that and the Bible passages shown on the screen, you would really think it'd be the end, but no. It's the end of the movie, people die, and that's all I can say about this. This one's actually pretty cool. Yet again, an ambassador must die to get the plot moving, and he does it using a pretty cool shotgun contraption. I don't know if it qualifies as something YouTube doesn't permit discussing. After all, he is possessed. It's cool, pretty violent, creative, so I like it.
Your father taught you that? My father is your father.
The first Omen 4 death you might not forget completely, even though I did. Josephine is hell-bent on doing something about girl Damien, despite the explosion at the healing fair. There's no proof anybody died there, so I can't count that. But she won't leave it alone, and upon finding out who she is, her fate is sealed. She's pursued by the family dog, all the way up to the top floor, goes out the window, not sure what they thought happened there, but I guess the dog wasn't blamed, and it's good enough. For this movie, that's something.
He brought you here. He chose you.
I feel the first Omen has less deaths that are intentionally caused, and focuses more on plot progression, if that makes any sense. Please don't take that out of context. And the ending is predictable, yet effective. It was pretty clear she was gonna stab Cardinal Lawrence. I mean, she obviously didn't turn evil. Don't know what he was thinking. It's not the best part of the movie by any means, but it's again just there. As you can see, this is not the easiest death ranking to make, especially the okay tier. Not a lot to say about this one, but it's good.
Desolate because his greatness was taken from him and he was cast down. But he has risen, Mark.
The death of Mark can't be understated, the fact that he's the youngest death aside from the infants, but it also solidifies that Damien has truly become the Antichrist. Not that it wasn't already obvious, but he wasn't too pleased upon finding out, so it is somewhat of a pivotal scene. Can't say it's one of the very best, but it's definitely impactful, sends the final events into motion, so it has to be relatively high. It's an effective death that has just the right impact. And this will surely bother some people putting Robert Thorn this low. Obviously it's a real memorable scene, Robert finally accepting Damien must die, and the idea of choosing between your son or stopping the Antichrist is something I wouldn't want to comprehend. The scene is tense as hell, it's an amazing climax, but there is one thing I can't ignore. Obviously it doesn't make sense that Robert is able to get on a plane and fly back there. Satan could just have the plane crash. I can look past that as that plot hole can't be avoided, but if he had that much time to think, why would he handle it like this? What did he think was gonna happen when he took off with a screaming kid?
This is not a good idea!
Are you telling me there's nothing else he could have done? You could argue Satan made sure he knew. Balak obviously did. But, I don't know, did he ever hear of duct tape? I get that it's the stress of the situation, but what did he think was gonna happen? And then when he finally gets there, he proceeds to try and stab him, even though it wouldn't really do any good. There isn't enough time to complete the whole thing, so that was pointless. And in a way, the remake kind of fixed this by not giving him a warning. Either way, I don't want to complain about it, it's such a good scene. But like I always say, they have to be ranked somehow, and everything from this point on is real damn good. So is this, but a thing called logic holds it back a little. And with that, I'm gonna ask you to subscribe. I'm just kidding, I've definitely killed that by now, but you could still like the video. I mean, it's free. To me, Mrs. Balak is part of the same scene, so the effect is just the same. There's again not a whole lot to say about it, as we just discussed it, but she is not okay with Damien being taken, and proves to be the most effective nanny, doing everything she can to stop it. This leads to a pretty brutal fight that ends with her being stabbed in the neck, which is likely the reason Damien didn't want to go for a car ride. Still not a perfect scene, but a satisfying death. This is the only real good Omen 4 death, and that's for one reason. Earl Knight, who we mentioned earlier, obviously is not pleasing Satan by snooping around and meets his demise via Wrecking Ball. Nothing inherently wrong with the scene, he is the only memorable character. It's also the only death that I didn't forget about, but that's not the reason why it's this high. No, it's this. You can say whatever you like, this priceless look on his face is almost worth the entire movie. Not to mention the scene is okay, it's the only one I really like that much, but this is just so damn hilarious, I can't help but put it this high. It doesn't really make any sense, and I just don't give a fuck. If the movie didn't suck, it would be a classic, and with that, Omen 4 is out of the running. Very early on. At the very least, it gave us this.
Jackal.
After the aforementioned toxic gas leak, that didn't affect Damien, Dr. Kane made the mistake of noticing the Jackal resemblance, and I think you know what that means. Climbing into an elevator sealed his fate, and after a lengthy but well done scene, he's split in half by a falling elevator cord. Not the best effects around, but a fantastic scene nonetheless, but it's simply outdone by a few others that I like a bit more.
I say, what are you talking about?
There is no doubt. Damien Thorn is the Antichrist.
I guess these two didn't realize the consequences of getting involved in this business, but the opening of Omen 2 ensures they'll get the memo. Given the length of this video, I'm not going to go into full detail of what led them to this rune, but the point is they see Damien's face, and that can't happen. The place caves in, they're buried alive, and yeah, that's a pretty bad way to die. A fantastic opening that sets the perfect tone for things to come. It's dark, cinematic, it's quite fitting.
Really, I didn't know.
You didn't know what?
Stop following me!
This one could have honestly been a lot higher despite being 15th place. He plays a relatively big role in the movie's plot, which I won't get into too much given it's a fairly new movie. Obviously this cannot be a spoiler-free video, that'd be impossible. But upon running into Paulo, a somewhat love interest, he's not too interested in talking for reasons we'll find out later, and upon telling her to look for the mark he's struck by an oncoming car, a common fate in this movie, and given he's not yet dead, she tries to free him, and only succeeds in freeing half. It's actually a pretty sad scene, all things considered, and fits with the movie's more gruesome tone. The reason it's not higher, though, is because we don't really know him that much yet. He's a somewhat love interest, that's it. I think the death really was just an accident, oddly enough, but it's still quite good. A brutal, impactful scene, the movie's quite big on those.
But it was him! I saw him! I saw him!
Going back to the dull Omen 3 scene we mentioned way earlier, the death of Brother Mattis is actually creative. The other two priests end up stabbing him to death, thinking he's Damien. If he was, that'd be a real early end. Maybe ideal. But honestly, the idea of Damien doing that is not that predictable. It's also creative, there's not much of that to be found in this movie. What happens next is just what happens, but this bit, I do like.
And he'll keep on killing. He'll kill anyone he thinks is threatening him.
To me, the end of Omen 2 is like the end of Omen 1, only it makes sense. Well, not completely, Satan could have easily still killed him way sooner, but this time he does not do anything stupid, he simply plans on killing Damien without making a scene. But what he doesn't realize is his wife is very much evil, and says no to that. The outcome is self-explanatory, and after that Anne is exposed of, no longer needed. I don't really know how liked Omen 2 is, but what a fantastic ending. You don't really think it's gonna end that way. It's more surprising than the first movie. That's still the better movie, but this ending really kicks ass. I'm sure most don't prefer it, but maybe I do. A very controversial decision, but I actually prefer Mrs. Baylock's death in the remake. In many ways, it's the same thing, but I put it higher because in this ending, opposed to being stabbed in the neck, she actually makes it outside, is run down by the car, and goes flying. To me, that makes it even better. Not much about the remake is better. You could argue the scene itself isn't as good, therefore this isn't. But in the end, fair is fair, it's an improvement, so I have to put it higher.
No, don't!
Same cannot be said for this hard-to-show scene that completely copies an Omen 1 death. So for that reason, I won't get into it, aside from the fact that it includes fire. I mean, if you're watching this video, you know what it is, but in this case, I don't mind them copying it because it feels more like a nice reference. I guess you could argue this being a prequel, it's supposed to be similar, I don't know, but I definitely don't mind it. It's a spectacle of a scene, and one that I enjoy.
I want you to take the boys out of the academy. I want you to send them to separate schools.
Marion said some things she shouldn't have said, so she had to die, and just the whole mood of this is perfect. It introduces the crow aspect replacing the first movie's dog, and even though they didn't keep using it, what a hell of an intro. It's a simple death just being a heart attack, but the setting, the mood, the fear, just makes it so damn memorable. It's the kind of thing you don't forget, maybe the most simplistic death in the top 10, but I just can't overlook how good it is. A perfect scene that sets the perfect tone.
Good girl.
Okay, it may sound odd putting a remake death that they changed this high, especially because the original is obviously higher, but I can't deny the remake is still pretty terrifying. She's injected by Mrs. Baylock. It would seem in the remake she's in much worse condition at this point. And even though it can't top the original, the idea of having this done to you when you can't even move, slowly waiting to die, knowing you're helpless to stop it, it's still a damn horrifying death. We're always going to have the comparison, there's no way of getting around it, but in my opinion, this one shouldn't be disliked. It's one of the remake's better moments, and one of the few things it didn't completely ruin.
Studio H, the next one along.
Oh, yes, thank you.
So that only leaves 4 movies, but the third one is gonna go out next. Brother Benito may be another stupid character, clearly putting himself into a bad position, but his death is so creative, memorable, and horrific, I can't help but put it this high. He ends up swinging from his ankles when the assassination attempt in the newsroom goes awry, incidentally starts a fire, swings into the fire, and continues to swing while on fire until they finally put it out.
Well, that went just about according to plan.
It's kind of too bad they put the best death in the movie this early, nothing else comes even close to beating it. It may not make any sense, like nothing in this movie does, but it's entertaining enough to claim a high spot. It's pretty horrific, definitely fun to watch, and that is it for Omen 3, otherwise known as definitely not the final conflict.
I don't want to be forgiven, Father Brennan. I just want it all to be over.
And as you may have guessed, Omen 1 and 2 are going to take up the top 6. Father Harris at the beginning of the first Omen is what I consider to be the best death in the movie. It's for a number of reasons, partly the relevancy of the scene, the fact that it's where the whole thing began. You kind of know something bad's gonna happen, you can tell by the mood. The pipe above them goes flying, glass falls from the sky. It's a real unique visual, not that common in this franchise, really the only scene like it, and in the end, Father Harris appears to be unharmed. But he isn't, obviously. And it's just a real cool scene. This movie definitely steps up the disturbing factor, and this scene is an early sign of that, but it's the mood, the overall unique way that it's done, that gives it this high position. I really do like it, and like I've been saying, you should check out the first Omen. It's honestly a great movie. It may not be the best death, but its run has to end here. Overall, not bad.
You see me in hell, Mr. Thorn? There we will share out our sentence.
And we now move on to Father Brennan, or as Salazar said, the satisfying sound of one's impalement. At this point, it gets real hard to rank the best deaths of these two movies, but in the end, this one has to be here. You do kind of feel bad for him, as he did try and do the right thing to make up for what he's done, but Robert isn't having any of it, as nobody ever does, and for whatever reason, Satan has this habit of letting you try and stop him, and then killing you as soon as you fail. In this case, the church doors are locked, but even if he did get inside, he'd probably just leave anyway, and stand in a real stupid spot. But no, there's no chance of that here, and upon the lightning rod being struck, he's satisfyingly impaled. Being the first death in the movie that isn't completely intentional, you probably don't see this coming, and while the remake didn't completely ruin it, the original just has a certain charm. It's an unforgettable scene, it really is perfectly done, it may not be the very best, but to some it definitely could be, and I wouldn't argue.
He was decapitated.
Murray, stop the car.
Joan may have not been the biggest threat, but obviously Satan isn't going to take kindly to a photojournalist, leading to an overly gruesome death. The crow may not be as iconic, but it makes an impact here, as it relentlessly pecks at Joan's eyes, leading you to think the crow might just finish her off. That's what I thought would happen, it was definitely possible, but in this case it simply pecks her eyes, leaving the handy-dandy truck to finish her off. This one stands out for that reason. The cause of death isn't initially clear, and not to mention, it's just plain brutal. At this point, ranking these are not easy. The creativity, the atmosphere, quite underrated in some cases, and the same can be said for Omen 2. It's honestly an underrated movie, a very solid sequel, and the top 5 is pretty damn good.
And if you don't do it, I will.
The original death of Keith Jennings, shamelessly destroyed in the remake, is honestly perfect. One thing it has going for it is anticipation. You find out he's destined to not have a head early on, but given it's the first movie, you don't know how it's gonna go. It's one of the few times a character's demise isn't blatantly obvious. There's a possibility he will make it, so when it actually does come, it's all the more effective. In this case, Robert had to have a mind change at the very last minute, putting Keith in the exact position for termination, that being flying rectangular glass, and while the head may not look that real once decapitated, the payoff is well worth it. If it had just been any character meeting their end, it wouldn't have had the same effect, but by building it up, hinting at what might happen, and still delivering a satisfying conclusion, it's plain and simply one of the best. Not my all-time favorite, but it was considered. The greatest Omen 2 death, that should be obvious by now, is in many ways the most terrifying. Bill, the senior manager of Thorn Industries, had to be taken out of the picture, and a fun-filled day of ice skating helped to get that done. He goes under, gets caught in the current, and we're given the terrifying image of seeing this from his point of view. It's an image that will likely stick with you, the desperate attempts to free him to no avail, and I was really tempted to put this at number 1. In the end, 1 was always going to be number 1, but the only reason it's not in second place is because I wish he hadn't come back up. It completely eliminates the desolation of this moment, not even sure where that hole came from, and overall it kind of makes it feel like a stupid horror movie death. Not really, because obviously it's Satan's doing, but without that, it probably would have been second. It's still an amazing scene, definitely the most terrifying, but not gonna be top 2. For reasons created by Satan, Holly is required to no longer breathe air, and decides to put a stop to this human function in a way that creates attention. She heads to the higher portion of the building, ensures that the occupants are aware of the current event, and engages in an activity that sees a much-needed body part is no longer in functioning condition. If you're confused, you can just watch the movie, maybe even rent it on YouTube. If you pay a fee, this becomes okay. So assuming you've done that and you know what happens here, yeah, it's a pretty iconic scene. The aforementioned mood, the aforementioned atmosphere, the overall effect. It's the first death you see aside from the unborn baby, and what a way to kick things off. It could have easily been number 1, literally nothing wrong with it, but one other death is a bit more effective. If you've been paying attention, you know what it is. And I could honestly just show it and that be enough. The remake did its own thing and that's okay, but it can't compare to this. To be honest, I'm kinda glad they didn't redo it, because this scene is so perfect, so atmospheric, utterly terrifying, it simply couldn't be redone. At this point in the movie, Katherine has to be officially taken out, and given that in this version she's capable of moving, a more direct approach is definitely needed. Let's just say Satan ain't fucking around at this point, and Robert's beloved wife is pushed out the window, and ironically enough lands directly inside the ambulance. So much about this creates the perfect, and I mean perfect scene. The evil stare Baylock gives, the look of complete fear and terror, but overall, it's the way it feels at this point in the movie. By that I mean pacing. And this kind of scene, this right-to-the-point nature, the fact that you, again, didn't know for sure if she would die, it just couldn't be any better. The franchise has so many good deaths, I didn't immediately know what number 1 would be, but the decision didn't take that long. There's just no beating it. It's one of my favorite death scenes in movie history, and while the Omen franchise does succeed at this, having more than one perfect death scene, nothing else is quite as perfect. Don't know if I'd say lightning in a bottle, but it's damn good. So that was all 39, or less, Omen deaths ranked. I certainly hope you enjoyed. These types of videos do take a long time to produce, so please consider liking the video and subscribing if you enjoyed. If so, remember to hit the bell for more horror-themed content this October. I'm still trying to reach 5,000, and hoping that I still can this year. I'm the Analyst, and remember kids, decapitation is key, but it's gotta be done right. So, you've made it to the end. That's an impressive feat indeed. Since you managed that, I guess check out the gaming channel, in which I cover a variety of gaming topics, like analysis videos, such as this one. If you're into that, then press the link in the description. It's that simple.